Sonic the Hedgehog, commonly referred to as Sonic 06, released in 2006 for the Xbox 360 and in 2007 for the PlayStation 3. It was intended to be a soft reboot for the franchise and attempted to evolve the formula of the adventure games after the mixed critical reception of Sonic Heroes and Shadow the Hedgehog. We all know what happened next. The game was rushed, riddled with bugs, and universally panned by players and critics alike. Lately though, with the rise of a fan remake titled Project 06, some fans' perceptions of Sonic 06 have shifted, with many people defending the original game and claiming that it was actually an underrated masterpiece all this time. And as much as I appreciate Project 06 for many reasons, I feel obligated to at least try to stop the spread of this misinformation. Because listen, just because you've played a fan recreation does not mean that you've truly experienced this game. I, on the other hand, have. I suffered through the entirety of this game on PlayStation 3, wading through every drawn-out loading screen, listening to every "it's no use" from Silver, and completing all 4 episodes, and now it's high time that I show you all the true nature of this game, and how it irreversibly affected our beloved franchise. Before I get into the video, I'd like to once again apologize for the quality of footage that you're about to see. I was originally planning to record my gameplay in 1080p using the Xenia emulator, but there were a myriad of graphical issues that I couldn't resolve, so we're sticking to original hardware for this one, 720p 60fps footage recorded directly from the PlayStation 3. With that out of the way, let's begin. This is my review of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Before anything else, it's imperative that we briefly go over the development history of Sonic 06 for proper context. If you already know what went on behind the scenes, feel free to skip to this timestamp. As for the rest of you, it's story time. Development on Sonic 06 began in 2004, with Sonic Team wanting to address the criticisms made towards Heroes in Shadow. Team lead Yuji Naka took inspiration from popular superhero movies at the time, such as Sam Raimi's Spider-Man and Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins, and suggested that the game should aim for a darker tone and feature more realistic environments. But after a reasonably successful preview at E3, things quickly started to head south. Sega demanded that Sonic Team finish the game before holiday 2006 to commemorate the series' 15th anniversary. This alone was nothing new for them though, right? Other 3D Sonic games also took about 2 years to make. Well, it would have been, if not for the absolute cluster truck of additional problems that built up over the latter half of the game's development cycle. Midway through development, Yuji Naka left Sonic Team to found a company that would go on to make games that nobody has ever heard of, leading Shun Nakamura to pick up the pieces. But things only got worse from here. Originally, Sega was planning to release the game on all major platforms that would be released that year, but when they realized that Nintendo's Revolution turned out to be a wee bit underpowered, they were forced to give up half of the development crew to make a separate game that would eventually become Secret Rings. This left the Sonic 06 team working under a strict deadline with only half of the development staff that they really needed, and this left no room for quality assurance. Before long, it was holiday 2006, and Sega shipped what they had, resulting in the release of what we now know as Sonic 06. First, let's talk presentation. Sonic 06 tries to aim for a darker tone than previous mainline entries. No, Shadow the Hedgehog isn't mainline, get over it. This, apparently, necessitated redesigning the entire Sonic cast with taller proportions and marginally more realistic textures. Originally, they were going to give some characters realistic fur, which would have been an interesting idea, but considering how much Sonic Unleashed struggled trying to render that on the same hardware, I'm glad they didn't stick with it. On paper, these designs should more closely match Yuji Yokawa's artwork, but in practice, they just kind of look wrong. Sonic is so lanky that he looks like he's going to collapse into a pile of blue spaghetti at any moment, and in-game his quills are animated so limply that his iconic silhouette is completely lost. This brings us to the cutscenes, with some being gorgeous pre-rendered CG, others being in-engine, and a few being a weird middle ground between the two. When it comes to the in-game cutscenes, I feel that these are poorly done, even for 2006. Despite having released 5 years after Sonic Adventure 2, with 2 better animated games releasing in between, Sonic 06's cutscenes once again use motion capture for their animation, and it's even more uncanny here with the lankier proportions and more realistic character designs, especially Eggman. With that said, there is one character that, to my surprise, is actually elevated by this approach, that being Mephiles. The weird, shaky movements combined with a completely static expression helps Mephiles succeed at being just plain creepy, especially when he's masquerading as Shadow. If Sonic Team had time to hand animate the rest of the characters, I think this could have made Mephiles stand out in this regard. Unfortunately, as it stands, all of the characters ended up falling maze of this uncanny valley, with their face rigs hardly ever being used save for some poor lip syncing and occasional eyelid movement. We can't talk about cutscenes without also mentioning the voice cast, which was replaced after the success of the Sonic X anime. This unfortunately means that the GOAT, Ryan Drummond, is no longer voicing Sonic, instead being replaced by Jason Griffith. While I don't think Jason is an awful fit for the character, it's clear to me that he either wasn't comfortable with the role yet at this point, or just wasn't given very good direction. He delivers nearly every line with the exact same intonation, and it gets kind of annoying after a while.
I've got to hurry and save Elise. That tornado's carrying a car. Woohoo! What a view! Gotta be careful not to fall off here. Gotta be careful not to fall off here. Gotta be careful not to fall off here.
Like my other videos, I won't be analyzing every single actor's performance, but there are a few more that I want to briefly go over. One of these is Knuckles, who is now voiced by Dan Green. I already didn't love Knuckles' voice direction in any of the previous 3D Sonic games, but if I had to choose between that and this version, I'd take the previous one any day. Knuckles sounds like a surfer dude bro in this game, and strangely still does, even in recent games such as Frontiers. On the more positive side of things is Dr. Eggman, now being voiced by Mike Pollock. While I loved Dean Bristow's performance in the previous entries, he is unfortunately no longer with us, so a recast was inevitable either way. Thankfully, Mike Pollock honors Bristow's legacy by giving Eggman a different but equally fitting voice. He absolutely kills it in nearly every piece of media that he's ever portrayed the character in, and it's no wonder that he's still being brought back to this day. As for the rest of the cast, I could take or leave them. Honestly, everyone just sounds like generic anime characters, which I suppose is fitting for better or worse, but we'll get to that later. The overall presentation in Sonic 06 just feels off. It definitely has that uncanny early 7th generation look that plagued realistic titles like Skyrim and Heavy Rain, with poor attempts at realistic models, weird pixelated shadows, and a heavy-handed reliance on bloom effects. What I find most irritating about this game's approach to realism is that it often uses bland grays and browns to portray its environments. Previous games such as Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 went for a more realistic look too, but still retained the vibrant colors and fantastical landscapes of the Genesis games. Meanwhile, many of the areas in Sonic 06 look like bad Gmod maps, and it's a slap in the face to the colorful and well-crafted level themes of previous entries. I'll probably get hate for this, but I also feel a similar way about the music. Don't get me wrong, there's several standout tracks such as His World, Kingdom Valley, and White Acropolis, but most of them feel kind of boring to me. Some seem outright derivative, like did anyone else notice how much Wave Ocean sounds like Take On Me? With the development history and presentation out of the way, it's finally time to get into the game proper. As was the norm with early 3D Sonic games, Sonic 06 once again features multiple campaigns offering a different perspective on the same story. This time, each of these revolve around one of 3 hedgehogs: Sonic, Shadow, and a new character, Silver. We'll go over these individually in due time, but first I'd better address the elephant in the room. Sonic 06 is an absolute mess. Even if you don't experience a single glitch throughout your playthrough, which I'm positive is impossible, you'll still be faced with sporadic bouts of slowdown along with egregiously long loading screens. Most games around this time tended to resort to low frame rates to keep their games chugging along at a reasonable speed on consoles. Meanwhile, Sonic 06 targets 60 FPS at all times, forcing the game to go in slow motion when too much is going on. That wouldn't even be so bad in your typical Sonic game, but Sonic Team must have been having a field day with the Havoc engine, because you are not going 1 second without coming across a physics object in this game. Even things that had perfectly fine behaviors in previous games use Havoc physics now, and often to their detriment too. There were multiple times where I was trying to pick up my dropped rings only to end up pushing them away because the game was still running physics calculations. And you'd think that this over-reliance on physics objects would be the only major culprit of this slowdown, but Sonic 06 really just seems to like chugging when there's no good reason, with this area of Soliana Castletown being just one example. Moreover, the loading screens are some of the most abysmal I've ever experienced in a video game, and not just because of their length, but also their sheer quantity. Why in the name of Cheez-Its do I have to wait through a loading screen after talking to a guy only to realize that he's not even done talking, and then wait through another one before I can start the mission? It's even worse if you fail, because then you have to go through that whole ordeal twice before you can try again. All of this combined makes for an extremely patience-testing experience on its own, but I also want to stress that this alone is not the only factor that makes Sonic 06 such such a travesty. Oh no, we're just getting started. So let's finally get into the individual campaigns. To preface, let's once again go over my 3 staples of Sonic excellence. For those of you who are new, these are the basic principles that I look for in a character's playstyle in a Sonic game. 1. Essential Sonic staples should be present. These include rings, springs, robotic enemies, etc. 2. Replayability should be encouraged through design. A good Sonic gameplay style should have a high skill ceiling for mastering the character's moveset and or challenging levels that become more fun the more you play them. And finally, 3. The character's central attribute should be important. By central attribute, I mean the core of the character's design. For example, Sonic is a hedgehog, so his gameplay should place emphasis on his ability to roll into a ball. Note that these don't necessarily denote a good playstyle period, but rather a baseline that distincts a Sonic game from any other generic platformer. Now, with these in mind, let's get into it. When starting up Sonic's story, we're greeted to the opening cutscene in the fictional country of Soliana, where a new character named Princess Elise is doing some sort of ritual until Eggman shows up to kidnap her. But don't worry, Sonic is here somehow, and he quickly saves her. We're then brought to an in-engine cutscene where Elise is kidnapped again, this time throwing a Chaos Emerald to Sonic before she's taken away. How did Elise have a Chaos Emerald when there's only 7 and Soliana has never been relevant until now? Who knows? Anyway, after a not-so-brief loading screen, we're finally in the game, and oh, this feels bad. Sonic's moveset has more or less been brought back to how it was in Sonic Adventure 2. We have the spin dash, homing attack, light speed dash, and bounce all accounted for, but there's one slight problem. None of these feel good at all. Unlike the adventure games and Heroes, which had a momentum system reminiscent of the Genesis titles, Sonic 06 does not, and it's painfully obvious at times. The game tries to convince you that it's there with sequences where Sonic runs on walls and through loop-de-loops like old times, but yeah, these are automated. Let go of the stick and you're either falling straight off or sticking to the ceiling. But 06 doesn't just fail at classic Sonic momentum, no, it just fails at basic platformer physics in general. The steering is super touchy, the slide and spin dash lock you into one direction, the air dash completely halts your momentum outright, and once again, the light dash is still finicky as all heck. Nothing feels quite right here, not just from a Sonic standpoint, but from a general gameplay perspective as well. Hub worlds return in Sonic 06, though they're much more empty and boring than an adventure. In these hub worlds, you'll be searching for and completing action stages and doing these awful town missions. But as for the action stages, these are fine in theory, but they're so railroaded that they become pretty boring at times, and when they do let you take shortcuts, the physics are so unreliable that it's better to just take the main path 9 times out of 10. Moreover, Sonic 06 also brings back enemy gauntlets, both in town missions and in the action stages, and many of these are mandatory to open doors. Even worse, Sonic doesn't have very good combat in this game, with the homing attack and bounce being the only semi-reliable moves, so be prepared to get constantly interrupted with mindless enemy spam. At least Heroes had a decently complex combat system to excuse this. Worse still, these stages aren't seamless like previous games, being interrupted at least 1 or 2 times by a 15-second loading screen. Oh, you're telling me that 15 seconds isn't that bad? Alright, let's sit through one together.
Darn!
Something unique to this game is its implementation of other playable characters besides the 3 hedgehogs. In Sonic's case, you'll occasionally play as Tails, Knuckles, and sometimes Silver, but we'll get to him later. The way that this is handled is something that I actually have to give Sonic 06 credit for. Basically, every stage you'll mostly be playing as Sonic, but every once in a while you'll run into one of his friends and play a small intermission as that character. These don't overstay their welcome and are a nice change of pace from the usual gameplay, so hey, that's 1 point for Sonic 06. Unfortunately, the actual quality of gameplay for these characters is a bit of a different story. Tails can still fly, though it's really touchy, but his tail whip has been replaced altogether with this awful dummy ring bomb attack. I believe this was in Heroes as well, but that game had other means of fighting enemies, while in 06, Tails' combat relies solely on this move, and it sucks. Knuckles also sucks. You can glide and climb, same as before, but his drill attack won't stop when you hit the ground, sending him careening off the edge. His close quarters combat also doesn't help things, considering countering the awful hitboxes of most enemies. So, how well does Sonic perform under the 3 staples of Sonic excellence? Well, it's safe to say that the first requirement is met, seeing as rings, springs, loop-de-loops, robotic enemies, and all of that good stuff is here and accounted for. However, Sonic quickly begins to struggle when it comes to the other 2. While replayability is suggested, with there being occasional shortcuts and alternate routes through stages, actually replaying these levels is something that I never want to do in my life, due to the horrible physics and mediocre level design. This version of Sonic just isn't fun to play as. Finally, while Sonic can spin dash, the rolling physics that made his gameplay iconic, and the very reason that he's even a hedgehog in the first place, are completely absent in favor of on-rails level design that tries desperately to convince you that you're doing amazing things, when really all you're doing is going through the motions. With the gameplay covered, I should also briefly go over the story. While the other characters in 06 are involved in things that are actually relevant to the plot, Sonic is stuck in a wild goose chase against Eggman, who I swear only exists in this game as a formality. He's after Princess Elise because he wants to release the Flames of Disaster to take over the world, more on that later, but Mephiles ends up doing that later anyway, so yeah, they were definitely struggling to make this guy relevant. Also, there's this weird romance subplot going on between Sonic and Princess Elise. I know this is one of the main things people always criticize, but can you blame them? It's just weird, and the worst part is that it's not even played off as a joke. The developers were actually trying to create a serious romantic relationship between a realistic woman and a blue mother truckin' hedgehog. Anyway, let's move on before my head explodes. You'll recall that Shadow was suggested to have died in Sonic Adventure 2, only to appear in Sonic Heroes to meet that game's playable character quota. Well, after his character was butchered to heck and back in his own game released in 2005, Shadow returns once again in Sonic 06, and his character is back to status quo, I suppose. Before we get into that whole thing, let's talk gameplay. Shadow plays similarly to Sonic, with some key differences, one being the lack of a spin dash. Considering the air dash gives you no momentum in this game, the fact that Shadow can't even spin dash is definitely a major blow to his game feel. Additionally, Shadow's combat is little different from Sonic's. Instead of bouncing off of enemies after a homing attack, he'll freeze in place and do this absolutely ridiculous animation every time you press the attack button until the enemy is dead. This is pretty tedious, but defeating enemies will fill up this gauge, which I should probably talk about. You may have also noticed this during Sonic's gameplay and wondered what the heck it was for. Well, originally this was going to deplete when Sonic used special moves from these gems that you can buy from the shop. Unfortunately, at some point during development, this bar just broke, and now it doesn't deplete at all, meaning it's pretty easy to cheese some of Sonic's sections. For the rest of the characters though, this bar works more or less as it should, and in Shadow's case, it allows him to go beast mode when it's all the way full. This will make his attacks stronger, while also making it nigh impossible to do homing attack chains for some reason. Cool. This combat system isn't all that deep, but Sonic Team must have thought otherwise, because if you thought the enemy gauntlets in Sonic's story were bad, you are not ready for Shadow. In some cases, there are multiple of these in a row with no checkpoints in between, making for a very tedious backtracking quest every time you die. But don't worry, his levels still get worse from here, because we also have vehicles, which, you guessed it, use the same awful havoc physics as the rest of the objects in this game. There are some parts that at first glance seem to be optional, but you'll quickly realize that the game will straight up fail you if you're not using a vehicle during that section. Great game design, guys. Since he's so similar to Sonic and faces the same problems, Shadow does about as well with the 3 Sonic staples as you'd probably expect. Essential Sonic staples are present, but the level design doesn't beg any return visits unless you're a pathological completionist, and its iconic gameplay from Sonic Adventure 2 is butchered even more than Sonic's. So what about the other characters? Well, in Shadow's story we have Rouge and Omega, both returning from Sonic Heroes. Rouge is basically a better version of Knuckles, seeing as she can throw bombs and place mines, meaning she doesn't have to deal with the wonky hitboxes that resulted from Knuckles' melee-focused combat. As for Omega, he's the diet version of Gamma from Sonic Adventure, as he was always destined to be. I want to say that the mechanic of locking onto multiple enemies is still here, but there's no HUD elements that indicate what you're locking onto, making for some extremely clunky gameplay. With all of that mentioned, how does the story fare in this campaign? Well, it kinda starts to get messy here. It starts off with Shadow and Rouge doing random missions for Gun until Rouge get clumsy with this random artifact called the Scepter of Darkness and breaks it, which awakens an ancient, ghost deity named Mephiles, who takes the form of Shadow and sends him to the future. Throughout the rest of the story, Shadow starts to put the pieces together of who Mephiles is, why he's here, and how he relates to Iblis, while also traveling through time way more often than any story besides Back to the Future ever should. At the end, Mephiles tries to convince Shadow to help him destroy the world, but Shadow manages to show some semblance of an actual character in this game and refuses, then proceeds to obliterate him. For now, anyway. Honestly, while playing Shadow's story, I didn't really understand what was even happening most of the time, and maybe I still don't completely, but Silver's story definitely ties some things together, so let's talk about him now. Silver, being a newcomer to the roster, is easily the most interesting playable character in this game. Like most Sonic characters, we don't know much about his actual origin, but what we are told is that he comes from a future that was destroyed by Iblis, aka the Flames of Disaster, long before he was born, which is a pretty compelling setup for a character. But before we get into the story, let's talk about his gameplay. Silver has psychic powers that allow him to manipulate objects and float in the air, which makes for an interesting idea for a playable Sonic character. However, when actually playing as Silver, it's a whole different story, unfortunately. While Sonic and Shadow's levels are speed-based with intermittent combat, Silver's are pretty much only combat and slow janky combat at that. Silver's combat is the Havoc physics engine. It just is. You hold down R1 to pick up random objects and throw them at enemies and watch them roll around in HD. It's a cool mechanic for the first 5 minutes, but you'll soon realize that the game doesn't do much with this. However, I discovered during this playthrough that you can actually stun certain enemies and then pick them up to throw at other enemies, which is an infinitely more interesting concept and one that I wish the game put more heavy focus on. Aside from one town mission that forces you to, the game never speaks of this mechanic, which is a shame because with a little polish, this could have been a much more engaging combat system. Unfortunately, that's not how things turned out, and Silver turned out to be slow, boring, and tedious despite having the most gameplay potential. With that said though, he does perform better under the 3 staples than either of the other Hedgehogs. Essential elements of the series are present, and Silver's abilities are important and utilized, even if not very well. 2 out of 3 is approaching a passing grade, though I would never want to touch these levels again with a 10-foot pole, so take that as you will. Of course, we can't forget the other playable characters, which in Silver's case are Blaze and Amy. If you've played through the Sonic Rush games, you'll know that Blaze having come from the same future as Silver doesn't make any sense, but I'd better leave that be before I go on another long tangent and make this video 2 hours long. Amy plays like how she did in Sonic Adventure, but without the running hammer attack that made her decently fun to play in that game. In place of this is the new invisibility mechanic that is never explained and doesn't end up serving any functional purpose, so I have no idea why this is even here. Blaze, on the other hand, is probably one of the best playable characters in this game, ironically enough. She handles similarly to Sonic, but she doesn't slow down nearly as much when attacking and jumping. Even when playing the exact same automated sections that Sonic does, it's clear just how much faster Blaze feels to play. It's just a shame that she's only playable in a handful of levels. Now back to the story. As I said before, by the time you finish Silver's story, everything kind of starts to make sense. I say kind of because this whole plot is still a complete mess, but I'll try to explain it as best as I can. So in the past, Soliana researchers were trying to find a way to harness the powers of their god, Solaris, but things go wrong and it tries to escape. The Duke of Soliana contains one half, Iblis, by using his daughter Elise as a vessel, and contains the other half, Mephiles, and the Scepter of Darkness. The catch is that if Elise cries, Iblis will be released, and if the scepter is broken, Mephiles will be released. Years later, Eggman crashes the Soliana festival in hopes of getting Elise to release the Flames of Disaster, and Rouge drops the Scepter of Darkness, releasing Mephiles. Iblis must also be released at some point in the future because in Silver's time the entire world is in ashes. Mephiles, with Silver unaware of his true nature, sends him back in time to kill Sonic, not because he's the cause of releasing Iblis, but because he knows that this will make Elise cry. Throughout this whole thing, characters are going back and forth in time, Eggman's doing random Eggman stuff, and non-essential characters are making cameo appearances, which just serves to confuse a plot that for all intents and purposes isn't really that deep. The game just wants you to think that it is. This brings us to the final episode, but before that I need to briefly go over the bosses. I feel like I haven't done the best job analyzing the bosses in past Sonic videos, so let me quickly recap one last time. In the Genesis games, bosses had a simple yet effective design philosophy. There's no limit to how many times you can hit the boss while it's vulnerable, only the amount of time that it is. This simple approach separates Sonic bosses from other platforming games, and in my opinion is how other Sonic games should approach their boss design. Sonic Adventure got pretty close to this, but made the fatal mistake of only giving the enemy 3 or 4 hit points, making them pretty easy to cheese. ease. Sonic Adventure 2 followed suit with this low amount of health, but rebalanced it by taking the route that other platformers do, only allowing the player to hit the boss once while it's vulnerable. Arguably, Sonic Heroes comes the closest to the classics in this regard, but it has the exact opposite problem as the adventure games, giving the enemy way too much health. So how does Sonic 06 compare? Well, when it comes to maintaining the philosophy of the classics, it fails. Most bosses follow Sonic Adventure 2's philosophy. The thing is, at least Sonic Adventure 2's bosses were well designed and fun. Meanwhile, Sonic 06's bosses make me want to pull my hair out. This is due to the lack of polish. Many bosses either don't make it clear what you're supposed to do, or what you are supposed to do takes way too long. Even worse are the character battles, which have always been a sore spot for the series, but Sonic 06 brings them down a whole new level. Everyone has heard about the Silver fight, but I don't think everyone knows just how bad this fight is. Silver has an attack that freezes you in place, then after a few seconds he throws you, forcing you to take a hit. There is no way to escape this. Once he grabs you, you just have to wait and hope you can pick up your rings in time. That's right, there's no cooldown on this attack. As long as you're in range, Silver will keep doing this over and over again until you're dead, and it is miserable when it happens. I eventually figured out that if you run around the perimeter of the arena, Silver won't be able to catch up with you and will instead do an attack where he throws a bunch of objects at you. During this, he's vulnerable, so you can land a dropkick on him, then rinse and repeat. This is never made clear by the game itself, and I'm honestly not even sure it's the intended strategy. Either way, even when you do it this way, it's still not very fun.
Spoiler alert, skip here if you don't want to see him.
Sonic and Elise are walking in GM Flatgrass looking all stupid when Mephiles shows up and stabs Sonic with a giant light sword. This moment right here I feel is symbolic. This is the moment when Sonic died. Not just the character, but the reputation of the franchise as a whole. The melodramatic soap opera-esque music in the background, along with the vacant, emotionless expressions on everyone's faces, just make this scene impossible to take seriously. Like, this is Sonic the freaking Hedgehog. This character is beloved to so many people, yet this game refuses to let me give a single darn about him literally dying. Anyway, this makes Elise cry, releasing Iblis, and Mephiles fuses with him and transports all of Sonic's friends to this weird limbo place. Apparently, the Chaos Emeralds now have the ability to bring people back from the dead, so it's up to everyone to split up and find them. This leads us to the final level, End of the World, which is basically this game's version of Canon's Core, but now with reused level design and these awful black holes. Once the emeralds are gathered, Elise uses them to bring Sonic back to life, but not before giving a kiss that I guess was either some unspoken step in this ritual, or Elise just really wanted to kiss a dead hedgehog. At this point I have no idea, I just want to erase my memory of this game and go play Sonic Adventure 2 instead. Unfortunately, I can't do that just yet, because once Sonic is brought back to life, he uses the Chaos Emeralds to turn himself, Shadow, and Silver into super forms to defeat the now reawakened Solaris, leading to the final boss. And despite being in a long lineage of final bosses that were final bits of spectacle to give the player a good lasting impression, Solaris is the epitome of everything that sucks about this game. Like the Silver fight, the game does a poor job of explaining what you need to do to defeat the boss, which is doubly worse here considering that we have never played as any of these super forms until now. Other games in the series made these bosses easy so that the player doesn't have to worry about that, but Sonic 06 is not so merciful. So basically, each hedgehog has a different set of attacks that do different things. Despite you starting as Sonic, you actually have to switch to Silver, which takes forever by the way, to make the boss vulnerable, and only then can you use Sonic and Shadow to do any actual damage. Worse yet, you're not only constantly losing rings during this battle, but despite the super forms having always meant to make you invincible, if you get hit, you will lose a huge chunk of your rings all at once, and if you're low and don't switch in time, that means you have to try the entire fight again. All of these annoyances combined with the blown out bloom effects and the projectile spam made this one of the most stress-inducing final bosses in the entire series for me, but I did eventually beat it, and that leads us to the final cutscene. Sonic and Elise are brought to the past before Solaris was ever released. They have the opportunity then and there to prevent all of this from ever happening, but this will mean that neither of them will have any memory of each other. Elise is hesitant to do this, even going so far as to say she doesn't care about the rest of the world. Okay, wow, that's kind of terrible, but Sonic convinces her to do it, and she blows out Solaris' flames, symbolizing Sonic Team wishing that this whole mess never happened. While Project 06 has given plenty of fans a false impression of what Sonic 06 really was, I also want to acknowledge that there are people who exist who actually have played the original game and enjoy it. To all of those people, whether you like the game despite its flaws or because of them, I respect you. If this game is a comfort place to you, then the game did its job for at least a few people in this world. But just because the game is enjoyable to you doesn't mean that you have an obligation to defend its honor. It's okay to enjoy a bad game, even unironically, but to claim that Sonic 06 was a hidden masterpiece all this time, I'm sorry, but I just can't defend that. This game is every bit of the awful mess that critics say it is, heck, maybe even more, but the lack of polish is far from the only issue that it has. This game is flawed from a design standpoint too, and I'd argue that the only way to fix Sonic 06 would be to make a different game entirely. But more importantly, this game is the reason that Sonic has had such a bumpy history ever since. Because of its critical failure, Sonic Team learned the wrong lessons, thinking that the adventure formula just wasn't working anymore, and has been trying to reinvent the wheel with every game since 06. While it's an honorable effort to try and right the wrongs of this game, in the end it's important that we never forget what it ultimately did to the franchise. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 destroyed a beloved icon, and he still has yet to recover, even today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my other Sonic retrospectives, become a member if you want, and subscribe for more video game content just like this. We're about to dive headfirst into all sorts of topics regarding Sonic Unleashed, so stay tuned, thanks for watching, and as always, enjoy life.